It began with the smell of rust, the kind that lingers in old wood and metal long after the last human hand has left. In the winter of 1964, a demolition crew was sent to clear the remains of an abandoned freight office near Topeka, Kansas. The structure was small, nothing more than a few warped beams and a sagging roof, swallowed by prairie grass and silence. No one remembered when it had last been used, but under the cracked floorboards in a space no wider than a man's arm, the foreman's flashlight caught a flicker of glass and paper. They pulled out a tin box, rusted and dented, sealed with wire. When they pried it open, the hinges cracked like brittle bone. Inside were railway receipts, old telegraph forms, and a single envelope tied with string. The paper had yellowed, the edges curled inward like petals dying in reverse. On the back, written in faint pencil, was a date, 1909, and below it, in smaller letters, Kansas Pacific Line. Inside the envelope lay a photograph. It was fragile, a gelatin silver print, sepia-toned, its surface scarred with scratches and folds. The corners had crumbled away, and a faint stain spread like a shadow across the lower half. But even beneath the damage, the image was clear. 4 boys stood on a train platform. Their faces were solemn, their posture stiff, their expressions caught between boyhood and burden. Behind them, a plume of steam blurred the shape of a locomotive, its black iron gleaming faintly in the morning light. The platform was wet, perhaps from rain, perhaps from something older. Each boy held a paper ticket in his hand. In the margin of the photograph, pressed in faded ink, were the words, Emporia Station, Kansas, March 17th, 1909. And beneath that, in handwriting that was not the photographer's, someone had added a note. Only 3 came back. When the photograph was delivered to the local archive, it was catalogued and forgotten. For half a century, it sat inside a file marked Miscellaneous Railway Records, buried among forgotten timetables and damaged maps. It might have stayed there forever if not for a historian named Walter Finch. Walter was not a man prone to superstition. He worked quietly, methodically, spending long hours digitizing photographs for the state's historical society. He liked the precision of it, the rhythm of scanning, labeling, preserving. He believed history was built of order and patience, not mystery. But when he found the photograph of the 4 brothers, something in him stilled. He studied the faces first. The eldest stood at the left, around 16 perhaps, wearing a dark wool coat and a cap drawn low over his brow. His jaw was sharp, his eyes focused on something beyond the frame, a destination invisible to the camera. Beside him, the second boy, maybe 14, clutched his ticket tightly, his fingers white at the knuckles. His expression was softer, but his stance betrayed tension. The third boy, barefoot and smaller, stood slightly behind the others, his ticket bent between his hands. And the youngest, no older than 8, stood apart, near the edge of the frame. It was this last one who drew Walter's eye. The child's coat was too large, the sleeves rolled up to his wrists. His ticket was held not against his chest like the others, but outward, as if offering it to someone just beyond view. The ink on the ticket had faded, but not entirely. The name printed there was faint yet readable under the lamp. It was not his own. Walter leaned closer. The name read Caleb R., but the rest had been smudged, as though rubbed by a thumb that refused to let the truth remain. Above the name, however, written in pencil so faint it nearly vanished, was another word, Jonas. He felt something strange in the pit of his stomach. Not fear, not quite curiosity, but a tightening, as though the image itself was holding its breath. He turned the photo over. The handwriting on the back matched no record he could find, but he recognized the ink as a type used by the Kansas Pacific clerks around the early 1900s. Still, the words didn't fit any official report. Only 3 came back. He opened the archive's ledger, flipping through the records of the railway for that year. Most were mundane: freight schedules, train manifests, maintenance notes. Then, near the end of the year, he found an entry written in a different hand. Hurried, uneven, derailment, 4 passengers unaccounted for, Kansas Pacific Line, westbound. 4. The coincidence pressed against him like a weight. He searched the newspapers from that month. The story appeared briefly on page 6 of the Emporia Gazette. Minor derailment near Cottonwood Falls. No major casualties. 4 boys traveling together reported missing but presumed relocated to family in Abilene. Presumed relocated. It was the kind of phrase used when no one had the time or interest to look further. Walter leaned back in his chair, the old office creaking around him. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, the faint smell of dust and rain drifting in. He glanced again at the photograph. The boys' faces seemed different under the shifting light. The eldest, once stoic, now looked wary. The second, anxious. The barefoot one, uncertain. And the youngest, the one with the wrong name. He seemed to be staring at something beyond the photographer, his eyes unfocused, yet deliberate. Walter blinked. For a second, he thought the faintest trace of steam had moved across the print, a ghost of motion that the still image could not possibly contain. He rubbed his temples and laughed quietly at himself. Fatigue, that was all. Still, he couldn't let it go. That night at home, he scanned the image and enlarged it on his computer. The digital version brought out details that the naked eye could not. The texture of the paper, the faint lines of moisture damage, even the thin shadow of a hand, not one of the boys, near the far edge of the frame, as though someone had stepped into view at the last second and been caught halfway between exposure and erasure. The next morning, Walter visited the old Emporia station. It had long been converted into a museum, restored to its early 20th century state. The platform was empty, the air still carrying a faint scent of coal and varnish. He walked its length slowly, running his fingers along the wooden railings, listening to the echoes of his own footsteps. The curator, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed his interest. "We used to get stories about that place," she said. "Folks said you could still hear the whistle on quiet nights, the one from the train that never made it through." "The derailment?" he asked. She nodded. "The one nobody ever claimed responsibility for. Said it was weather, but the records don't match." Walter hesitated. "Were there children aboard?" The woman thought for a long moment. "Could have been. We lost a lot of names that winter. Records burned in a storage fire years later." "Why?" He showed her the photograph. Her face changed. She reached for her glasses, holding the image closer. "Well," she said slowly, "would you look at that? That's the old Kansas Pacific platform. Sure enough. Do you recognize any of them?" She shook her head. "No, but there's something odd." She pointed to the youngest boy. "See how he's standing? Not like the others. It's like he's being told to wait, or stay." Walter felt the back of his neck prickle. When he returned to his hotel, he placed the photograph on the desk, flattening it carefully beneath a glass pane. The lamp's glow made the surface shimmer slightly, revealing faint fingerprints long embedded in the emulsion. He studied them, one large, one small, overlapping. He turned away for only a moment to pour water from the pitcher. When he looked back, the reflection of the lamp seemed different. The light now rested across the boys' faces, and the youngest wasn't looking down anymore. He was looking directly at him. Walter froze. The air in the room felt heavier. He blinked several times, leaning forward, certain his eyes were playing tricks. The boy's face hadn't changed. It couldn't have. But something about his gaze felt alive, intent, almost expectant. He lifted the glass, running his thumb gently across the image. The texture of the photograph was cool and smooth, but under the surface he could feel the faintest rise, as though the ink of the ticket in the boy's hands had thickened. He brought it closer to the light. The name was different now. Not Caleb, Jonas. The handwriting wasn't printed. It was drawn, uneven, almost as if written from beneath the paper. Walter's pulse quickened. He dropped the photo onto the desk, staring at it from a distance. The air conditioner hummed softly, the clock ticked, the world was still, and yet he felt watched. He turned the image face down, but that night, when he tried to sleep, he kept hearing it, the faint echo of a train whistle, far off, fading into the dark, and beneath it, the sound of paper shifting slowly, as if something inside the drawer was turning itself over, one last time. The year was 1909, and the wind that swept across the Kansas plains carried the scent of iron and rain. It was the kind of wind that seemed to hum through every wire, that bent the grass and whispered against the tin roofs of farmhouses. Along the stretch of the Kansas Pacific line, trains passed like moving storms, heavy, loud, and filled with the promise of elsewhere. On the morning of March 17th, the Finch brothers stood at the edge of the platform in Emporia, their boots slick with mud. The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to cut through the mist, and everything looked washed in gray and gold. Steam drifted along the tracks like low clouds. The train had not yet arrived, but they could hear its approach, the slow thunder of its wheels, the metallic cry of its whistle rising through the cold air. Their mother had packed their things in a small trunk 2 nights before. She hadn't said much, only that their uncle in Abilene would meet them, and that the farm they were leaving behind had nothing left to give. The winter had stripped the fields bare, and their father had been gone 2 years already, taken by a cough that had never healed. The eldest, Thomas, tried to look older than his 16 years. He kept his brothers close, his hand always hovering just behind their shoulders, as if to guide them without showing it. Beside him was Eli, 14, his face paler than the others, his coat too thin for the cold. Jonah, barefoot despite the chill, carried a tin lunch pail filled with bread and an apple. He said little, though his eyes moved constantly, studying every motion on the platform. And then there was Caleb, the youngest, standing slightly apart. His hat was too large, his hands too small for the ticket he held. He stared at it, tracing the printed letters with his thumb. When the train arrived, the world seemed to shake. The whistle split the morning open. Men shouted, doors clattered, steam billowed out in great clouds that swallowed everything in white. The conductor's voice echoed through it all, calling destinations in a rhythm that sounded more like prayer than schedule. Abilene, Selena, Hayes. Thomas gathered them close. Keep hold of your tickets, he said. Eli nodded. Jonah gripped his lunch pail tighter. Caleb's hands trembled. As the train slowed to a stop, its iron heart hissing, Thomas reached for Caleb's arm. Don't let go, he said. But Caleb wasn't looking at him. He was staring down at his ticket again. Something was wrong. The name printed there. He could read it now under the new light. It wasn't his. Jonas Finch. He blinked. The letters wavered. He turned to his brother. Jonah was beside him, quiet as always, clutching his own ticket. Jonah, he whispered. This one's yours. Jonah frowned, looking at it. No, mine's right here. He held it up. It bore his name. Caleb looked down again. The paper felt damp, though it hadn't been raining. He rubbed at the letters, trying to wipe them away, but the ink only smeared. Behind the printed name, faintly, another word began to show through, written in pencil as if someone had traced it long ago. Caleb, Thomas called to them, his voice sharp through the steam. Come on! The whistle screamed again. The boys moved as one, boarding the train with the crowd. The conductor, a heavy man with a beard the color of soot, punched their tickets without looking up. When he reached Caleb's, he paused. His eyes lingered on the name. You headed for Abilene? He asked. Caleb nodded. The man studied him a moment longer, then clipped the corner of the ticket and handed it back without another word. The boys found a seat near the rear of the carriage. Wooden benches, windows fogged with condensation. The air smelled of oil and damp wool. A woman in a black dress sat across the aisle, her hands folded neatly around a rosary. Beside her, a man with a newspaper coughed into his glove. As the train began to move, the rhythm of the wheels filled the car like a heartbeat. Thomas leaned his head against the window, eyes half closed. Eli read a worn pamphlet about land opportunities farther west. Jonah pressed his face to the glass, watching the world slide by in streaks of gold and gray. Caleb sat quietly, staring at the ticket in his lap. The ink had bled into the paper, the name still there, but softer now, as though the page had absorbed something living. He tried to remember when he had last heard his name spoken aloud. His mother's voice, perhaps, or the way Jonah used to call him when they were younger, running through the fields near the river. But in that moment, the memory felt distant, fragile, like the sound of a bell carried on the wind. An hour passed, then another. The light shifted as the clouds thinned, revealing long, endless miles of prairie grass and the distant glint of water. Occasionally the train would stop at some small station. Newton, Selena, Wilson. Passengers would get off. New ones would climb aboard. But the four brothers remained silent, their presence barely noticed by anyone else. It was just past midday when the woman with the rosary spoke. Where are you boys headed? She asked softly. Thomas lifted his head. Abilene. She smiled faintly. A good town, that one. You have family there? Our uncle, Thomas replied. He's expecting us. The woman nodded. That's good. It's important to have family. Her gaze moved to Caleb. And you, young one, what's your name? Caleb hesitated. The rhythm of the wheels seemed to grow louder, pressing into his chest. He opened his mouth, but the word caught in his throat. Jonah answered for him. Caleb, he said. The woman's smile faltered. Caleb, she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then she looked down at her rosary, her lips moving silently. When she raised her eyes again, her expression had changed. You hold on to that name, child, she whispered. Names are the only thing that stay when everything else goes. Caleb didn't understand, but something in her voice unsettled him. He looked away, out the window. The sky had darkened. Far ahead, clouds gathered low over the horizon. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain. By late afternoon, the train reached the open stretch between Ellsworth and Bunker Hill, a desolate span of track running parallel to the Smoky Hill River. The conductor moved through the carriage, lantern swinging, calling for tickets once more. When he reached the boys, Thomas handed his over. Eli followed. Jonah did the same. Then came Caleb. The man studied his ticket again, brow furrowing. You already showed me this. Caleb frowned. No, sir, you didn't. The conductor turned the ticket over. The ink was smeared beyond recognition. This one's been stamped already. I don't. The man held it up to the light. For an instant, the name was visible again. Jonas Finch. He looked at the boy. That's not you, is it? Caleb didn't answer. The train jolted suddenly, a harsh metallic groan shuddering through the cars. Passengers gasped. Outside, the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain began to fall in sheets against the glass. The conductor steadied himself, muttering a curse. Track's slick today, he said. You boys stay put. He moved on, lantern swaying, boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. Thomas looked at his brothers. We'll be fine, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The storm grew louder. The air inside the carriage felt colder, heavy with the smell of wet wood and iron. The windows fogged completely, turning the world outside into a shifting blur of gray. Caleb pressed his hand against the glass. For a moment he thought he saw a reflection, not of himself but of another boy, older, standing outside the train, his face half hidden by mist. He blinked. It was gone. The wheels screamed suddenly, a high, terrible sound. The train lurched. People shouted. The world tilted. Somewhere ahead the whistle wailed like an animal caught between breath and death. And then, silence. When Caleb opened his eyes, everything was white. The steam had swallowed the world. The air smelled of iron and smoke. The train lay scattered across the plains, its cars twisted and broken. He heard groans, voices calling out through the fog. Thomas, Eli, Jonah. But the only sound that answered was the hiss of the boiler and the faint ringing of something metallic spinning on the ground. He stood slowly, his head pounding, his clothes damp with rain. The sky above was the color of ash. Bodies moved through the fog, some crawling, some still. He began to walk. A few yards ahead he found Jonah's lunch pail, dented and open, the apple crushed inside. Beside it lay a single ticket. The ink had bled completely, but the faint outline of a name remained. His own. Caleb knelt beside it, the rain cold against his neck. He picked up the ticket and held it in his palm. For a moment, the letters darkened, as if rewritten by an unseen hand. Then they vanished. Behind him the whistle cried again, not from the wreckage, but from somewhere beyond the fog. A sound that grew louder and closer, though no train came. He turned toward it, and there, standing on the tracks, was the figure of a boy, older, familiar, watching. When the storm broke, the plains swallowed the sound. The air was heavy with the smell of steam and burnt wood, and the snow that followed came like ash, falling slow, clinging to what was left. The wreck lay in the open field, its shape barely recognizable. The iron engine had overturned, its wheels half buried in the frozen soil. From a distance, it looked like something that had been there for a century, though it had only been minutes. Rescuers came from the nearest town by horse and lantern. They worked through the night, their voices echoing faintly against the cold. Some called names, others prayed. They found the conductor's lantern first, still burning, lying beside the rails. Then they found Thomas. He was alive, his coat torn, his face streaked with blood and soot. When they asked what had happened, he only muttered a single word, "The bridge," before his voice faded into silence. The others were harder to find. Eli was discovered near the third carriage, pinned beneath the broken beam of a bench. His pulse was weak but steady. He didn't speak. His eyes were open, fixed on something above him that no one else could see. Jonah was missing, and Caleb. No one found him at all. By dawn, the wreckage had been cleared, the injured carried to nearby farmhouses. The dead were laid on canvas sheets by the tracks, their faces covered. The local sheriff took down names where he could, though many tickets had burned, and the passenger list was incomplete. He counted 33 souls total, 4 unaccounted for. The Finch brothers, it was said, were 3 of the survivors, but there had been 4. The records from that day were later stored in a small courthouse vault, written in careful ink. The handwriting faltered near the bottom of the page. Beneath the list of survivors, someone had added a note in pencil. 1 ticket found with name unclear, ink washed by rain. Possible duplication of passenger Jonas Finch. For weeks, the people of Emporia spoke of the derailment as they might speak of a storm. Tragic, but soon to pass. The wreck was buried under snow, and time moved on. But among the rescued, silence lingered. Thomas, when he finally woke, refused to talk about the night. Eli recovered slowly, though he carried a limp from then on. And Jonah, the third brother, would not travel by train again for the rest of his life. He claimed that the whistle still came to him in dreams, that it called not from ahead but from behind. He told no one about the shadow he had seen in the fog that night, the shape that had walked beside the wreck, quiet and slow, as though counting. He tried to forget, but when he turned 17, something changed. One morning, he found an envelope on the porch of the small house where the brothers now lived with their uncle. It had no return address, only his name written in faint pencil, Jonas Finch. Inside was a ticket, a train ticket. The date read March 17th, 1909. He stared at it, his hands trembling. It was identical to the one he had carried that day, down to the punched corner and the smudged ink, but there was something different this time. At the bottom of the ticket beneath his name, another word had been added, Caleb. He dropped it. Thomas found him sitting on the porch steps, pale and shaking. "What is it?" he asked. Jonah held out the paper, but when Thomas took it, the page was blank. "It's nothing," Thomas said, frowning. "You're just tired." But Jonah wasn't tired. He knew what he had seen. That night he dreamed of the wreck again, the snow, the smoke, the sound of something moving beneath the twisted steel. But this time, the dream didn't end there. He saw the four of them again, standing on the platform holding their tickets. The whistle blew, the steam rose, and as the train began to move, the smallest boy looked up and smiled. Then he turned toward Jonah. "You took my seat," the boy said. Jonah woke with a cry. The house was silent. He sat for a long time listening, and then he heard it, the faint hiss of steam, far off, like a train pulling into a station that no longer existed. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out across the empty fields. There, near the fence line, he saw it, a figure, small, still, standing by the tracks that had long been removed. It didn't move, but its outline shimmered in the dark, as though it were standing in a different kind of light. Jonah didn't sleep again that night. Days turned to weeks. The ticket vanished from where he had left it. No one mentioned it again, but strange things began to happen in the house. The clock in the hallway would stop at the same time every night, 3:17. Footsteps echoed faintly in the attic when no one was there, and sometimes when the wind rose just right, the faint sound of a train whistle drifted through the walls. Eli said it was nonsense. Thomas told him to pray. But Jonah could feel something following them, something that hadn't stayed buried beneath the wreckage. One afternoon he went to the station. It was empty now, the rails torn up, the platform splintered by years of rain and sun. Weeds grew through the cracks in the wood, but the air still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. He walked to the edge of the platform and knelt. In the dirt below, half buried, something caught the light. He dug it out carefully. A ticket. His breath caught. It was the same kind, yellowed, brittle, the ink nearly gone. But when he brushed away the dirt, he saw the name written across it in faint pencil, Jonah Finch, and below it, pressed into the paper as though written from underneath, Caleb. He stood there for a long time, the sky dimming, the sun a dull orange disk sinking into the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the dry whisper of grass and dust. Somewhere, faint but distinct, came the sound of wheels turning on rails that no longer existed. Jonah turned toward it. The air shimmered above the tracks, bending the light, and for a moment he saw them again. 3 figures standing in the distance, blurred by heat or memory. Thomas, Eli, and the smallest, standing apart. He called out. The sound died before it reached them. Then, as the wind shifted, the smallest figure raised a hand. Jonah froze. The boy's face was hidden by shadow, but he knew who it was. He had always known. Caleb. And in his other hand, the boy held something small and white, a ticket. Jonah stepped forward, heart pounding, but the figures were already fading, dissolving into the evening light like smoke caught in sunlight. When he looked down again, the ticket in his own hand was gone. In its place lay a piece of paper, old and fragile. On it was a short note, written in that same familiar pencil. "You took my name." The ink bled slightly as if the paper were still wet. Jonah folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. He said nothing to his brothers. That night he burned it in the stove. The flames turned blue for a moment, then vanished. But the next morning, the same note was back on the table unburned. He didn't touch it again. Years later, after Thomas had gone west and Eli had married, Jonah stayed behind, tending to the land their uncle left them. He never boarded another train, but on nights when the wind carried the sound of distant whistles, he would take the photograph from the drawer, the one they had taken that morning in Emporia, and hold it under the lamplight. The 4 of them stood there, frozen in time. Only now, the youngest looked different. His head was tilted slightly, his mouth almost smiling, and the ticket in his hand, no longer blank, was clear again. The name was his. The year turned, and with it, the memory of that wreck should have faded. But it didn't. It clung to the Finch family like the smell of smoke that refuses to leave old clothes. Thomas worked the land and tried to pretend it hadn't happened. Eli went to church every Sunday and prayed without saying for what. And Jonah, the 3rd brother, carried silence like a sickness. The years passed, but the sound of the train never left him. He would wake sometimes before dawn, his heart pounding, his ears ringing with a phantom whistle that only he could hear. In those moments he felt certain someone else was in the room, someone standing just beyond the edge of sight. He started avoiding mirrors. It was on one such morning, after the first frost of 1914, that he found something new on the kitchen table, a photograph. He didn't recognize the paper at first. The edges were browned, curling inward. The image was faint, like it had been washed in weak tea. But as the light from the window touched it, he saw the shape of 4 boys. 4, not 3. He froze. They were standing on the same platform from the memory he'd spent years trying to forget. The same mist, the same train, the same posture. But in this photograph, the smallest boy was clearer than ever, his face calm, his eyes fixed, not on the camera, but on Jonah himself. He turned it over. There was writing on the back. Not much, just one sentence. in small, neat letters. "We never left." Jonah sat there for a long time, the morning light crawling across the floor. He knew he hadn't dreamed it, he hadn't even owned a camera. When Thomas returned from town, Jonah showed him the picture, but Thomas only frowned. "That's impossible," he said. "It's been years." Jonah held it up. "You see it too, don't you?" Thomas studied it a long moment before he answered. "I see 3. Jonah's stomach tightened. "3? Thomas nodded. "Thomas, Eli, Jonah, that's us." Jonah looked again. The 4th boy was still there, as solid as the others. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, Jonah took the photograph and hid it under his pillow. But sleep didn't come. The wind outside carried the low groan of something moving through the distance, a sound like heavy wheels grinding across rails. It grew louder until the windows trembled. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered into the night. The fields were dark, but near the horizon, a thin white line shimmered, a streak of light cutting through the mist. And for the briefest moment he saw it, the silhouette of a train. No engine, no smoke, just light. He turned away. When he looked again, it was gone. Days later, Eli fell ill. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but Jonah didn't believe it. The illness came too fast, too sudden. Eli would wake in the night gasping, whispering names that didn't belong to anyone they knew. Once, Jonah heard him murmur, "Caleb," before his voice failed. Jonah tried to comfort him. "There's no Caleb, Eli. It was only us." Eli's eyes opened slowly. "That's what you think," he whispered. "He's been waiting." Jonah froze. Eli smiled weakly. "You can hear it too, can't you? The train." Jonah didn't answer. Eli died 2 nights later, just before dawn, and on the morning they buried him, the whistle sounded again, low, distant, and impossibly real. Jonah stood at the grave, hands shaking, breath visible in the cold. The others bowed their heads, but he couldn't. He was listening, and he swore he could hear voices beneath the whistle, soft, almost kind, repeating his name. That night he returned home alone. The house was silent, the air still. He sat by the fire, the photograph in his lap. 4 boys stared back. He ran his fingers along the edge of the paper, tracing the smallest one. "Why won't you leave?" he whispered. The flames flickered, and then faintly, the smell of coal. He looked up. Across the room, near the doorway, stood a boy, barefoot, coat too large, hat tilted forward. Jonah didn't move. The boy's face was pale, almost gray, the shadows soft around his jaw. "Caleb," Jonah breathed. The boy tilted his head. "That's my name." Jonah rose slowly. "You're not real." Caleb smiled faintly. "Neither are you." The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward like embers of time burning in slow motion. "What do you want?" Jonah whispered. The boy stepped closer. The floorboards didn't creak. "It's not what I want. It's what you owe." Jonah shook his head. "I don't owe you anything." Caleb's eyes lifted toward the photograph still in Jonah's hand. "You took my place." Jonah felt his throat tighten. That's not true, but he remembered. The ticket, the conductor's confusion, the way his own name had bled into another's. Caleb's voice was soft. "You boarded. I waited." Jonah looked down at the photograph again. The youngest boy's hand was empty now. The ticket was gone. When he looked up, the room was empty. The fire had gone out. He sat there until morning, the photograph limp in his hand. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too hollow. Outside, the frost clung thick to the grass, each blade sharp and silver. When Thomas came in later, Jonah said nothing. He couldn't. He simply handed him the photograph. Thomas looked at it and frowned. "Where's the 4th boy?" Jonah's breath caught. He snatched the photo back. The 4th boy was gone. Only 3 remained. He ran outside into the cold. The air stung his lungs, the world spinning. At the far edge of the field, near the place where the old tracks had once run, something glimmered in the dirt. He fell to his knees and brushed away the frost. A ticket. It was perfectly preserved, as if the paper had never aged. He lifted it carefully. His name was written there, Jonah Finch. Below it, faint but visible, another line in pencil, Caleb Finch. The whistle sounded again, close this time. He looked up. Through the mist, he saw the faint outline of a train, its shape more shadow than substance, its windows lit with a pale, unnatural light. Inside, figures moved, vague, translucent, familiar. He took a step forward. The sound grew louder, the ground trembling beneath his feet. Then Thomas's voice behind him. "Jonah." He turned. The train was gone. The field was still. Thomas stood a few yards away, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "What are you doing?" Jonah held up the ticket. "He wants it back." Thomas frowned. "Who?" Jonah looked down at the paper again. It was blank. He lowered his hand. "No one." That was the last time he spoke of it. Years passed. Thomas moved away. Jonah stayed, alone in the house that creaked with memory. The photograph, now faded almost to nothing, hung above the mantel. When visitors came, they saw only 3 boys, but Jonah saw 4, always 4. On the night he died, decades later, the neighbor who found him said the room smelled faintly of coal and rain. The photograph lay on the table beside his bed, 4 boys, 4 tickets, and under the lamplight, the faint outline of writing appeared on the back. Arrive safely, all 4. When the old Finch house was finally sold, the new owners found the photograph first. It was wedged behind a loose board above the fireplace, hidden away so carefully that even the dust had learned not to disturb it. The frame was cracked, the glass clouded with age, but the image beneath was strangely untouched. 4 boys, 4 tickets. The back of the photograph was blank at first glance, though under the right light one could see the faint impression of handwriting, like someone had written there, then pressed it flat before the ink had dried. It read, "Arrived safely. All 4. The couple who bought the house were young. They didn't think much of the picture at first. They liked the charm of it, the old wallpaper, the way the floorboards creaked with every step. They decided to keep the photograph on the wall where they'd found it, just above the mantelpiece. It felt like it belonged there. For a time, it was simply decoration. Guests would comment on it, drawn by the eeriness of the boys' expressions, by the stillness that seemed to linger around their faces. "They look too serious," one friend remarked, "like they knew something the rest of us don't." The couple laughed it off, but small things began to happen. On quiet nights, when the wind swept hard across the fields, the wife swore she could hear a low sound in the distance, a whistle, faint and far away. It was always at the same hour, 3:17 in the morning. Her husband teased her at first until the night he heard it too. They went outside with a lantern, searching the fields that had long since swallowed the old rail line. The wind was sharp, the grass whispering in long, uneven breaths. They saw nothing, only felt the tremor of something that was not there, a vibration beneath the earth, like the echo of heavy wheels on buried tracks. They didn't speak of it again. The weeks passed. They hung curtains, painted the kitchen, brought life back into the quiet rooms, but the air of the house never warmed. Every clock they owned stopped at the same hour, 3:17. The photographs they took on the mantel would come out blurred, not all of them, just the ones that showed the wall above the fireplace. And sometimes when they passed through the living room late at night, the faint scent of coal and rain hung in the air. The wife began to notice something else. The photograph changed, not drastically, only small details. A faint smudge of steam where there hadn't been before, a slight tilt to one of the boys' heads. The youngest especially seemed different, his eyes softer one day, colder the next. Once she could have sworn his hand had shifted. She tried to tell herself it was the light. Old photographs played tricks. Shadows deepened, emulsion warped, faces moved where none had been. But then one evening she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A 5th ticket. It lay on the wooden platform beside the boy's feet, faint, almost transparent, as though it had been part of the image all along, waiting for someone to notice. She called her husband to look. He frowned. "It's just the reflection of the glass," but she could see it. And when she leaned closer, the name written on it became clear, inked in the same faded pencil that had haunted the back of the photo for years. Her husband's name. The next morning, the photograph was gone. They searched everywhere. The frame still hung on the wall, empty, the nails cold to the touch. But the picture itself had vanished. That night the whistle came again, louder this time. The wind shook the windows, and somewhere deep beneath the ground a sound began to build, like the slow groan of metal turning after a century of rest. They turned off the lamps, listening, and then, as if out of the air itself, a voice, soft, young. "Ticket, please." The sound came from the hall. The husband grabbed the lantern and stepped toward it. His wife followed, heart pounding. The light flickered as they reached the doorway, and there, for just a moment, they saw the outline of 4 figures standing near the far wall. 4 boys. Each held a ticket. Steam rolled across the floor, curling around their feet like fog. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision was gone. The air went still. The next morning, the frame was full again. The photograph had returned, but the wife couldn't look at it anymore. Something about it was wrong. The edges seemed darker. The platform stretched farther into the distance, as though the world inside the picture had grown larger. And behind the boys, barely visible in the mist, was the shape of a man in a conductor's hat. She packed the photograph away that day and took it to the county archive. The clerk there logged it under anonymous donation. Early railroad photograph, Kansas, 1909.